Hi, welcome back to Christine's Home Affairs. In yesterday's project, I showed you how to make this quilted table runner. Today, we're going to be binding it. So whether you're working on quilts or table runners, the process for the binding will be the same. And I'll just say also that this is just one way of putting binding on. There are so many different ways of putting them on. Bindings can be different sizes as well. So come along whilst I show you how to attach a binding to this table runner and a couple of different options for finishing it off. And if you'd like to make this table runner, go and find yesterday's video. I've got all the instructions for that, as well as a written pattern that you can purchase if you want to. When you've made a quilt or a table runner like this, the first thing you want to do is determine the amount of binding that you're going to need. You will need to measure the entire project. So the easiest way to do this is to just fold it in half and grab your tape measure, and we're going to measure from the fold up to the corner. And if you just had a square quilt like this, you would come around and continue measuring like that. Because I've got a couple of extra corners, we just need to turn it a bit more. So measure from the fold to the corner, pivot the tape measure, measure to the point at the top, pivot the tape measure again, come down to the other fold and add a little bit extra for good measure. So this measures 46 inches. Remember, we've only measured half of this table runner. So 46 inches by 2, that's 92 inches in total. Now, most of us won't have a strip of fabric that is that long, so we have to join a few pieces. So what I've got here are some strips of fabric that are cut across the whole width of the fabric. Most quilts are bound with a 2.5 inch strip. I'm using a 2.25 inch today, which is about 5.5 centimetres. I've gone with that because that was all the fabric I had left to cut. So normally I would have done 2.5 inches. Doesn't matter though. So I've got 92 inches that I need here. I need to join some fabric. So when I make joins, I need to make an allowance for that. But I also want to have an extra piece of fabric just so that I can cross them over when I finish the binding. So we need to make allowances for all of those things. When we join our binding strips, we'll be overlapping it like that. So we've already lost almost 5 inches in fabric here. So for each join, you're going to lose that. So with 92 inches, I'm going to allow about 100 inches or 2.5 meters of finished binding strips. So what I will do, take my binding strip and grab the other one, have one running along in this direction here, and grab the other one and place that over the top like this. And what you will do from there, I'll overlap this just so that you can see what's happening. You can see there's a corner here and along here. We want to mark a line from one corner to the next. And that's our stitching line. I'll place a pin on the stitching line just to show you what's going to happen. So when you sew along here and open this fabric out, you're going to have a nice diagonal stitch across here, and you'll have a nice straight edge going along on top and bottom. And what will also happen is that this fold is distributed across that 2.5 or so inches, and as everything's folded later, it's going to distribute all of that bulk, and you won't have really bulky seams on your quilt or table runner. That's the first one. Go back to the other end of your fabric, grab your next strip of fabric. You don't have to overlap them, but it is easier to see. Mark your stitching line, and you'll just repeat that process for all of your binding strips that you might need for your project. Let's go to the machine and we can sew up those diagonal lines. Place that diagonal line directly underneath your needle and follow that stitching line as you sew, and we'll backstitch at the beginning and the end. Once you've done that one, move on over to the next one, and if you have others to do as well, you'll just continue on. Now for the next step, you're going to need your iron. So we've got our little ears flapping about here, what we're going to do before we trim it back is press these seams open for each of the joints that you have. And once you've done that, we can trim the excess fabric off. So just bring the fabric pieces together again, have your overhanging bits face together and trim that back so that you've got about 1/4 of an inch seam. And then you've got a nice diagonal line across here and it's sitting nice and flat. Repeat for the other one, pinch those together and cut those off. Next thing you need to do is grab your pressing mat or go to your ironing board, which I still haven't found, and we're going to fold the fabric in half with the wrong sides facing each other, and you have a much nicer finish on your quilt if you take the time to iron this. If you just take it straight to your quilt and try and stitch down, it won't look as nice. Just press that all the way from one end to the next, and you can see where the join is here. When you fold that in half, the bulk of that seam has been distributed right across the width of that fabric there. If you're working on a quilt that's got curved edges, you'll need to cut your fabric differently. These strips have just been cut across the grain and it's all very simple because we just have straight edges that we're going to bind. If you're doing a rounded project or a circular quilt, you'll need to cut your fabric on the bias so that you can have nice, evenly toned fabric when you put the binding on. And before we attach this binding, we're just going to double check that we've got enough fabric to go around. So I'll fold this in half, place that on the folded edge here, and just line it up along the edges and double check that I've got enough fabric to bind this project. And you can see that I have a good few inches along here excess. And I need all of that so that I can put the binding pieces together at the end later. So now that that's all ready to go, we can attach it to our quilt or table runner. Now you don't want to start at a corner. You'll start anywhere along a straight edge of your fabric. So I'll start around about here where the center is, and I'll start clipping the edge in place. I'm not going to start sewing right at the top here. I want to leave a good 6 inches or 15 centimeters or so flapping about. I'm going to start sewing here and continue on until I get to the end here. When I get to this point here, this is where the diagonal is on my fabric. We're going to sew this with 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. I'm going to stop 1/4 of an inch in from the outside edge. I'm only using this so that you can see what I'm doing. Where I've stopped there, I'll flip the fabric up and then I'll flip it down again and start sewing right here and keep on going until I get to the next point. So that will create a nice little pleat which we'll hide when we fold it over. You don't need to go and pin or clip all of this in place. Just do the first one because as you start sewing, things are going to distort. You'll work out your pivot points as you get to them. And I'll show you that when we get to the machine. When I joined my strips together, I used a stitch length of around 2 because I was making cuts in the fabric. I just wanted to have my stitches closer together. When I'm placing my binding onto the edge of my runner, I'm going to increase my stitch length to 3. It doesn't need to be tight, so 3 will be a really good length. If you've got a walking foot for your machine, put that on. It'll make all the difference for you. Otherwise, if you've got a 1/4 inch foot, put that on as well. That'll help you keep nice and straight. I don't have a walking foot for this machine, so I'll just have to stitch straight. I'm using a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. I'm starting around the center of the quilt, and as I said, I've left a long tail at the beginning. Let's get to it. I'm coming up to the diagonal here. I'm going to mark where that diagonal is, and then I'll check where the 1/4 of an inch mark is, and I'll sew up to that. Back stitch, and end your work there. Then you'll flip your fabric up, and then we'll flip the fabric back down again so that it sits in line with the edge of your quilt. And then you'll start sewing at that 1/4 of an inch, which is in the same place that you've actually finished sewing just before. Now we're coming up to a proper square corner here. So the edge of the quilt finishes here. We've got our side edge along here. We're going to sew up to a 1/4 of an inch before the edge of the quilt. And you don't have to make this measurement each time you go, but I'm just showing you where it is. Backstitch and end your work. So I've stopped 1/4 of an inch from the edge of my quilt. Flip that up, and that fabric has a nice diagonal in line with the rest of the quilt. Turn it around and flip that forward, and you want the top of the fold to be in line with the other side and straight along here. So this is what you'll do on regular corners of your quilts, and then you can start sewing with your 1/4 of an inch seam again. I'm coming up to that funny angle again. I'll flip it up and down and continue. So now we're on the straight edge. We can just continue on all the way down. I'm coming up to the other end where we've got the other square corner. I've made a mark along the edge and come in a 1/4 of an inch, and that's where we're going to stop sewing. Flip it, fold it, and continue. I'm almost at the end where the two pieces are going to meet. I'm going to leave probably about 8 inches unstitched here. So I've got a long tail here. We'll backstitch. We've finished binding everything up to this point. So we've got our folded edge along here and here. Double check the measurements of the width of your binding. Mine is 2 1/4 inches. So what I'm going to need to do here, measure the width of the binding across here. You can do that 2 ways. You can just open out your binding and make a mark along there, or you can measure the width of your binding from the outside edge in, which will give you the same measurement. We'll open this out, and where you've made that mark along here, we're going to draw a diagonal line from there down here, and that will become the stitching line for the last join in our binding. Take the other end, lay that directly over the top and bypass the end here and come up to the mark that we've made here and transfer that marking to the end of your binding there. So if we have a look here, we've got this end here that will finish up in line with the width of your binding. We can trim the rest off. And now what you will do, and this is the reason why you need to have a good amount of space in here, is because you need to be able to fold your fabric in and manipulate everything. Take this piece of fabric and open that out. Grab this piece and open that out as well. Just bring your quilt together and lay the cut edge over the long edge here. And if you have a look at the other side, we've got that diagonal line we've marked, and we're going to sew from here down to here. When you've done that and you close up the binding, that will fold together again, and then you'll have a really nicely joined binding. So I'll show you that one more time. We've got our folded binding strips. Open this one out and this one here. This short end needs to sit along the long end. When you have those lined up nicely, you can sew across there. We'll do that now. So just move the table runner out of the way here And this is where it's a little bit fiddly. Fold up your table runner and place those binding strips under your machine. Backstitch. Open out those folds in your binding so that it's nice and straight, and sew on that diagonal. And that's it. So before we cut this, we're just going to double check that it's looking right. So if we just open that out again, forget about these folds for the moment. And as long as that sits nice and flat underneath, we know that we can go and cut everything off that's not needed. So we'll finger press this seam open and we can cut off that excess. Press it open again, and then you can just pull that taut. Everything's nice and flat. Go back to where you finished stitching back here, backstitch, and then we can sew that last piece in place. And that's it. So we've sewn our binding on. All we need to do is finish it. So if you have a look at the corners up here, we've got a proper square corner here. This one's probably only about 60 degrees. But what you will do is fold the fabric over to the other side. You have a nice point across here, and you go and iron this as well so that it sits nice and flat. When you bring your binding around to the other side, that will fold over, and that side will fold over as well, and you'll have a really nice finished corner here that follows along to the other side. And on this weird angle here, you'll do the same. All you'll do is push that one down, that one across, and you've got a nice angle here and along this side as well. So you can continue to fold the edges over and have everything in place for when you sew, especially if you're doing this by machine. I'm going to show you how to do this by hand and machine, because I know there are lots of people that don't like hand sewing at all. I actually love it. It's so soothing and therapeutic, and nothing beats a quilt that's got a proper hand binding on it. So this is how it's going to look when you're finished, hopefully. Let me show you now how to bind this if you're sewing by hand. So I've got a needle and thread here, and we only want one strand of thread as well. I've got a knot in the end somewhere, and you can start anywhere you like. So I've got the folded edge of my fabric here. I'm going to bring the needle in between the layers and come out on that folded edge. And what that's going to do is hide that little knot underneath, and then I can start to sew. So you just want to do this gently, you don't need to tug. Where I've come out with my thread is where I'm going in with my needle. I'm going in on the backing fabric. I'm not going all the way through, I'm just picking up the thread on the top layer, and then I'm going to come across probably about 1/4 of an inch. So you can see I've come up with my thread here and gone straight down into the fabric, and then I've come up underneath about 1/4 of an inch further along with my needle right on that fold, and secure that in place. And if you get your thread matched properly, you'll have invisible stitches along here. So once again, I've got the position where I've got the threads come out. I'm going down in that same place but on the green and white fabric, and then just come across about 1/4 of an inch. That one's a little bit more, doesn't matter. And you keep going. So it's very quick. You can sit in the lounge, watch your favourite soap, and just go along and bind your quilt. when you come to one of your corners, just double check everything's folded over properly. Hold that little diagonal in place until you get there. And you'll stitch that in place a couple of times. And continue on. And when you've finished, if you've run out of thread, then all you need to do is do a couple of really small stitches in place here, and that'll lock up nicely. And then where you've come out here, go with your needle in between the layers of fabric, come down around about here, and trim off the thread right on the fabric. Give it a rub and it's disappeared. And then you can continue on with a new thread all the way around. Now that you've sat through that, I'll show you how to do this by machine. I've gone and put clips along the entire outside edge of my binding just to keep everything folded in underneath nicely. And to sew this binding on neatly, I'm going to sew it from the top. What I want to do is stitch right in the ditch. I want to try and sew as straight as possible with that needle coming down in between the cream and the red fabric. It's unlikely that I'm going to do that perfectly, but I'll see how I go. And what will happen is that the stitching in the ditch here will sew the back of the binding in place. The back of this binding is actually overhanging a little bit more than what it is on this side. If you've got a domestic machine, you might have a stitch in the ditch foot. It's got a little metal bar that will follow along on this join here, and that will make the job a lot easier for you as well. I've increased my stitch length to 4. When you get to the corner, turn and continue on. I'm coming up to one of the diagonals, so I've got that folded over nicely on the top. I just want to make sure that this fabric is still folded nicely underneath, so I'll push that toward the machine, fold that pleat toward myself. And if you're uncertain as to how that's going to sit, you can stitch into the corner and then back stitch. Obviously I'm uncertain, and then continue stitching in the ditch until you finish the entire quilt top. And it's natural to want to go fast as you're doing this, because you think to yourself, you're just going straight. Surely you can do a nice straight line without veering off. But trust me, it doesn't happen. You're much better off going really slow if you want to be able to stitch in the ditch properly. So far I've resisted the urge to put the foot right down. I'm still going slow and things have been nice and straight. See how long that lasts. I've come up to the funny angle again. I'm going to trust myself this time and see what happens. I'm at the very top of the quilt now. I can turn around and finish the last sides. Okay, we've completely finished the binding for this table runner, and now we can have a look and see how it turned out. I actually didn't do too bad a job at stitching in the ditch. This is obviously the better side here. You can see the seam in underneath there. I've gone nice and slow and just stitched nice and straight right in between the layers of fabric there. And on the other side of the quilt, you'll see the stitching line, how it's caught that fold in the fabric. So along here, I've stitched along, I've gone too fast and accidentally stitched over the cream fabric. It's not a big deal, the thread and the fabric match. But if you have a look underneath here, I've hand sewn from here to here, and you can see how neat that is there. You can't see the stitching, it's almost invisible. It's really neat, and there's no stitching on this side of the fabric at all. And the corners sit nice and evenly. The corners at the top here sit okay as well. That's from the machine. This is the one where I've stitched in because I wasn't sure how it was going to work. So there's the fold over here and my stitching line is along here. Had I been sewing this by hand, I would have seen that and been able to manipulate it better. And the other corners are okay, but you can see along here, I haven't necessarily caught all the fabric when I've been sewing from the other side. So I do think hand sewing a binding on is much better looking. It's more professional if that's what you're going for. And it's just so therapeutic. Anyway, that's how I've sewn the binding on this quilt. As I said, there are many ways of sewing bindings on and finishing them up. This is just one of them. Oh, there we go. We have a completely finished table runner, perfect for Christmas, with the little stripy fabric on the back. I've used the stripe on the back to hide all my sins. But a very simple technique for putting bindings on. What's your preference? Do you prefer to do them by hand or machine? Machine is certainly a lot quicker. It took me 7 minutes to put the binding on by machine, and I know it would have taken me about an hour and a half to put it on by hand, but it would have been so therapeutic as well. I really do enjoy hand stitching bindings. So very simple, quick project for you today, just stitching the binding onto a quilt or any other products that you might need to bind. If you like this pattern, go on back to the video I posted yesterday. I'll pop a link in the description and up here so that you can find it if you want to make it. If you prefer written instructions, I do have a file with written instructions on my website that you can purchase. I hope you've enjoyed this video and I shall catch you next time. Bye for now.